There is a specific kind of historical question that does not go away. Not because people keep inventing it, but because the underlying material keeps showing up in places and records that have nothing to do with each other. The question of unusually large human skeletal remains found across North America is one of those questions. It has appeared in county histories, federal excavation reports, regional newspapers, and the private correspondence of 19th-century archaeologists. The consistency is what makes it worth examining. Not any single claim, but the pattern across independent sources separated by geography, time, and motivation. To be clear about what this video is and is not. This is not an argument that a secret society is hiding forbidden knowledge. It is an examination of what was reported, what was collected, what was documented, and where the documentation becomes harder to follow. The evidence will be presented in the order it was recorded. The interpretation, if any, belongs to you. Start with the geography. The eastern half of North America is home to thousands of earthen mounds. These structures range from small burial sites to enormous geometric enclosures covering multiple acres. They were built by cultures now referred to collectively under the mound builder designation, though that term covers a wide range of distinct peoples and time periods. The Adena culture, active roughly between 1000 BC and 200 AD, and the Hopewell tradition, which overlapped and followed, left behind burial mounds that stretched from the Great Lakes down through Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and into the southeast. Later, the Mississippian culture produced the large platform mounds, the most famous being Cahokia in Illinois, which at its peak around 1100 AD housed a population estimated between 10,000 and 20,000 people. That would have made it one of the largest cities in the world at the time. These mounds were opened in large numbers during the 19th century. Some were excavated by trained researchers. Many were opened by farmers, collectors, and curious locals. What came out of them included pottery, tools, ornamental objects, and human remains. It is in the reporting of those human remains where the recurring detail first appears. Across dozens of accounts spanning roughly 1820 to 1890, the skeletal remains described were noted as being significantly larger than average. The measurements given varied, but reports of skeletons between 7 and 8 feet in reconstructed height appear with enough frequency across enough separate locations that the pattern itself is documentable, regardless of what one concludes about it. These were not all reported by the same person, in the same state, or in the same decade. They came from Ohio, Tennessee, Wisconsin, Minnesota, West Virginia, and elsewhere. They were reported in local papers, in letters to state historical societies, and in some cases in publications connected to what would eventually become formal American archaeology. That frequency is the first thing worth sitting with. If this were a single anomalous report from one location, the explanation would be simple. Exaggeration, misidentification, or enthusiasm for a good story would cover it. But the geographic spread and the timeline make that explanation harder to apply cleanly. A farmer in Wisconsin in 1855 and a survey team in Ohio in 1872 and a county historian in Tennessee in 1880 are not coordinating their accounts. They are reporting independently, and they are reporting similar things. The second pattern worth noting is what happened to the physical remains after they were collected. In many cases the answer is either incomplete or inconsistent. Objects were transferred. Institutions changed hands. Records were reorganized. Some remains were repatriated to tribal nations under later federal law, which is documented and accounted for. But there is a category of material where the chain of custody simply becomes difficult to trace, and that gap exists in the official records themselves, not just in speculation around them. This is where the Smithsonian Institution enters the story. Not as a villain. Not as a confirmed conspirator. But as the institution that received, cataloged, and in some cases lost track of more excavated material from this period than any other organization in the country. What that paper trail actually shows is the subject of what comes next. Before any institution was involved, before federal archaeology programs existed, and before there was any organized effort to collect or classify what was coming out of the mounds, the local press was already reporting on it. Newspapers in the 19th century functioned differently than they do today. They were frequently the first and only record of local events, and editors often printed eyewitness accounts with names attached because the community knew the people involved and accountability was immediate. These were not anonymous internet posts. These were signed, published, community-facing statements. The accounts begin appearing in volume around the 1820s and continue through the 1890s. They are not concentrated in one region. A survey of digitized newspaper archives from this period turns up reports from New York, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, Minnesota, West Virginia, Tennessee, and Georgia, among others. The details vary in some respects but align in others with enough consistency to warrant attention. One of the earlier documented accounts comes from Chesterville, Ohio. A report from 1829 described the opening of a mound that contained a skeleton measured at roughly 7.5 feet. The account noted the condition of the bones and their position within the burial. It was reported matter-of-factly, without the theatrical framing that would come to characterize later popular writing on the subject. It read as local news because that is what it was. In 1833, soldiers stationed near Lompoc Rancho in California reported uncovering a burial during construction work. The skeleton was described as large, the skull noted as double-rowed indentation, and the remains were reportedly surrounded by carved stones and shells. The account circulated in several publications of the period. It was not a mound burial in the traditional sense, but it joined a growing number of reports describing anomalous physical characteristics in skeletal remains found across the continent. By mid-century, the reports were coming in with enough regularity that some newspaper editors began treating them as a recognizable category of story. In 1870, a report from Sauk County, Wisconsin described a mound excavation that produced multiple skeletons, with at least one measured at over 7 feet. The account was specific about location and gave the names of the men present during the excavation. In 1872, the Seneca County Advertiser in Ohio published a detailed account of remains found in a burial mound near Tiffin. The skeleton in question was described in terms of height and bone density, and the reporter noted that local physicians had examined the remains before they were moved. The involvement of physicians and surveyors in these accounts is worth noting. These were not all farmers telling stories over a fence. Some of the reports involved men whose professional reputations were connected to accuracy. A county surveyor who filed an incorrect measurement in an official capacity risked his standing. A physician who publicly examined remains and offered a description was doing so in a context where he could be questioned on it. In 1883, a report from Dunleith, Illinois described mound excavations that produced remains of considerable size, and included reference to copper artifacts found alongside the skeletal material. Copper artifacts are well documented in Hopewell and Adena burial contexts. Their presence in the same reports that describe unusual remains is not incidental. It places the accounts within a known archaeological framework rather than outside it. The Wisconsin State Historical Society received correspondence throughout the 1880s from county-level historians and collectors who had personally observed or participated in mound excavations. Some of that correspondence survives in archival form. Among the details recorded are measurements of skeletal remains that sit above the range typical for populations of the period. The average height for American men in the mid to late 19th century was approximately 5 feet 7 inches. Reports consistently describing remains at 7 feet or above represent a significant deviation, and when those reports come from multiple observers in multiple states over multiple decades, the statistical argument for mass exaggeration becomes less straightforward. We are investigating the timeline they tried to erase. If you want to see the documents I found next video, make sure to subscribe. By the late 1880s, the newspaper record had become dense enough that several amateur historians began compiling regional surveys. One of the more cited of these is the work of John T. Short, whose 1880 publication on North American mound builders drew on both newspaper accounts and correspondence with excavators. Short was not a credentialed academic, but he was methodical in citing his sources, and his compilation pointed to a geographic pattern that matched what the individual newspaper accounts were showing independently. What is notable about the newspaper record as a whole is not any single account. It is the distribution. Independent reporters in states with no shared editorial culture, writing for audiences that had no connection to one another, produced accounts that described the same physical anomaly across a 70-year window. The volume of that record is a historical fact regardless of what one concludes about the remains themselves. What the newspaper record does not tell us is what happened after the accounts were written. In many cases, the remains described were either reburied, transferred to collectors, or sent to institutional repositories. In some accounts, the trail ends at the point of discovery. The remains were noted, described, and then the record goes quiet. That silence is not itself evidence of anything deliberate. Records from this period were inconsistently kept at every level. But the silence is consistent enough across enough cases that it forms its own pattern, and that pattern points toward the institution that received more of this material than any other. The Smithsonian Institution's Bureau of Ethnology began its systematic survey of North American mounds in 1881 under the direction of Cyrus Thomas. That program produced a major report in 1894 that remains one of the most comprehensive documents on mound archaeology in the country. What that report contained, what it excluded, and how its conclusions shaped the subsequent treatment of anomalous physical evidence is where the paper trail becomes worth following very carefully. The Bureau of Ethnology was established within the Smithsonian in 1879. Its early mandate was to organize and systematize the study of Native American cultures, languages, and material remains. By 1881, Cyrus Thomas, an entomologist turned archaeologist, was placed in charge of what became known as the Mound Survey. Over the following decade, his team excavated or documented more than 2,000 mounds across the eastern United States. The 1894 report that resulted from this work, titled Report on the Mound Explorations of the Bureau of Ethnology, ran to nearly 750 pages and became the foundational institutional text on the subject for decades. The report's central argument was that the mounds were built by the ancestors of contemporary Native American peoples, not by a lost race or a separate advanced civilization. That conclusion was scientifically reasonable, and has held up well under subsequent research. The mound builder myth, which had circulated widely in popular culture and in some academic circles, proposed that the mounds were built by a vanished superior race that preceded Native Americans. That theory was wrong, and Thomas's work was an important corrective to it. But the report's value as a corrective to one bad theory does not mean it resolved every question the mound record raises. The 1894 report addressed the origins question. It was less thorough on the question of what the remains themselves measured, and it was notably selective in which physical descriptions from the pre-survey period it engaged with directly. The catalog of material transferred to the Smithsonian during and after the survey period is extensive. Pottery, tools, ornamental copper pieces, carved stone objects, and human remains came in from excavations across multiple states. The human remains in particular were subject to an evolving set of institutional policies. Early in the survey period, remains were accessioned and stored. Later, under the provisions of the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act of 1990, known as NAGPRA, many of those remains were returned to tribal nations. That process is documented, legally mandated, and accounted for in institutional records. The area where the record becomes harder to follow involves the pre-survey material. The Smithsonian did not begin systematic collection in 1881 from nothing. It had been receiving donated and transferred material from collectors, state historical societies, and individual excavators since the mid-19th century. The accessioning records for that earlier material are not uniformly complete. Some items have full provenance documentation. Others have partial records. Others appear in early catalogs and then do not appear in later ones, with no recorded explanation for the gap. This is not unique to the Smithsonian. Large institutional collections from the 19th century routinely have incomplete provenance records. Items were transferred between departments, relabeled, consolidated, or simply misplaced over the course of a century and a half of institutional change. The National Museum of Natural History, which houses much of the Smithsonian's anthropological collection, has acknowledged in its own published materials that portions of its 19th century holdings have documentation gaps. What makes the gaps relevant to this particular examination is their concentration. The category of remains that newspaper accounts from the same period described as anomalously large is precisely the category where the institutional record tends to thin out. This could mean several things. It could mean that the newspaper accounts were exaggerated and the remains, when properly examined, did not measure what the reporters said they did, so there was nothing anomalous to catalogue. It could mean that anomalous remains were catalogued under general categories that obscure their specific measurements. It could mean something else entirely. What it does not mean, on the basis of the documentary record alone, is that any specific decision was made to suppress specific findings. That conclusion requires evidence that the available record does not clearly supply. What the record does show is a pattern of institutional priority. The 1894 report focused on resolving the origins debate. That was the politically and academically significant question of the period. Whether individual skeletons measured 6 feet 5 or 7 feet 2 was, within the framework of that debate, a secondary question. The survey was not designed to catalogue and analyze anomalous physical measurements. It was designed to establish cultural continuity between mound builders and contemporary native peoples. Given that framing, it is not surprising that measurements which fell outside the expected range received less systematic attention. Whether that was an oversight or a choice is a question the available record leaves open. There is one additional element of the institutional record worth noting. In 1968, a researcher named Vine Deloria Jr., a Standing Rock Sioux scholar and author, wrote critically about the way the Smithsonian and the broader archaeological establishment had handled Native American remains generally. His later work, including his 1995 book Red Earth, White Lies, challenged specific conclusions in the scientific consensus on early American populations. Deloria was not arguing for a giant race. He was arguing that the institutional framework through which Native American history had been interpreted was shaped by assumptions that served specific cultural and political purposes. His critique was substantive enough that it contributed to the policy changes that eventually produced NAGPRA. The point is not that Deloria validated any specific claim about skeletal measurements. The point is that credentialed, serious scholars have raised questions about the completeness and neutrality of the institutional record, and those questions exist independently of the more speculative interpretations that circulate around the same material. The physical sites themselves offer another layer of the record, and they are in some ways the most concrete evidence available. What was on the land before certain institutions and landmarks were built, and what the documented record shows about how those sites were cleared, is a dimension of this subject that the paper trail connects to directly. That is where the physical and the documentary records meet. The mounds were not only excavated. Many of them were removed. The 19th century expansion of American cities, farmland, and infrastructure coincided directly with the period of heaviest mound disturbance. In some cases the removal was incidental, a mound in the path of a road or a field that needed clearing. In other cases the removal was deliberate, and the site was chosen specifically because of what was there. The distinction matters because it shapes what kind of record was created and what kind of record was not. Cahokia in Illinois is the largest surviving mound complex in North America. Monk's Mound, the central structure, covers more ground at its base than the Great Pyramid of Giza. It is a genuine architectural achievement by any measure, and it sits today largely intact because it was recognized early enough as significant to preserve. But Cahokia was not always treated that way. The surrounding complex originally included more than 120 mounds. Today fewer than 80 survive. The others were leveled during the agricultural and urban development of the 18th and 19th centuries. The city of Collinsville, Illinois, and the surrounding area were built in part on or adjacent to what was once the most populated pre-Columbian city north of Mexico. The destruction of mounds in the Ohio Valley followed a similar pattern. Marietta, Ohio, was one of the first planned American cities in the Northwest Territory, founded in 1788. Its founders were aware of the mound complex on the site. Some of the mounds were preserved by the original town plan, and several survive today. But the broader Scioto and Ohio River valleys, which contains some of the densest concentrations of Hopewell mound construction anywhere in North America, were systematically altered by farming and development across the 19th century. The physical record of what those mounds contained was largely dependent on what was documented before or during their destruction, because after the destruction there was nothing left to examine. This is where the replacement dimension of the historical record becomes concrete. What replaced the mounds was not simply neutral development. In several documented cases, public buildings, churches, and civic institutions were constructed on sites that had previously been reported as mound locations with significant burial content. The courthouse square in a number of Ohio towns was placed on or immediately adjacent to documented mound sites. This was sometimes noted in local histories of the period without any apparent sense that it was unusual. In Miamisburg, Ohio, the Miamisburg Mound survives as one of the largest conical burial mounds in the eastern United States. It is now a state memorial. But the surrounding area was developed extensively in the 19th century, and local records document the removal of smaller associated mounds during that period. The material from those removals was inconsistently recorded. Some of it went to collectors. Some of it is noted in county histories. Some of it is not accounted for in any surviving document. The pattern in Indiana follows closely. The Angel Mound site near Evansville, now a state historic site, preserves a significant portion of a Mississippian village complex. But the broader region was subject to extensive mound removal throughout the 19th century, and the documentation of what those mounds contained is fragmentary. The Indiana Historical Society has published work acknowledging that the mound record for the state is significantly incomplete due to undocumented removals during the development period. In Wisconsin, the removal record is particularly well documented in a negative sense, meaning the records of what was lost are more complete than the records of what was found. Increase Lapham, a Wisconsin naturalist who published a detailed survey of Wisconsin mounds in 1855, documented the existence of mound groups that no longer existed by the time subsequent researchers came to verify his findings. The mounds he recorded had been plowed under, built over, or graded away in the decades between his survey and the follow-up attempts. His original documentation is therefore the only record of what those sites contained, and his documentation, thorough as it was for its period, was not designed to capture the kind of physical measurements that would later become relevant to the question being examined here. What this physical and documentary record shows collectively is that a significant portion of the mound record was destroyed before systematic scientific methodology was applied to it. The material that was recovered and transferred to institutional collections represents a fraction of what was originally there. The fraction that made it into documented collections is itself incompletely recorded. And the specific category of remains that the newspaper accounts described as anomalous is the category least likely to have survived intact through multiple transfers, policy changes, and institutional reorganizations over a century and a half. None of that constitutes proof that anything was deliberately removed or suppressed. It constitutes a documentation problem, and documentation problems are common in 19th century American institutional history. But it does mean that the absence of anomalous remains in current accessible collections is not, by itself, evidence that the newspaper accounts were wrong. Absence in the current record and absence in the original record are not the same thing, and conflating them is one of the places where the historical analysis of this subject most frequently goes wrong in both directions. That distinction, between what the record shows and what the record does not show, is the foundation of the questions this material ultimately raises. And those questions deserve to be stated plainly. After working through the newspaper accounts, the institutional record, and the physical history of the sites, several questions remain that the available documentation does not cleanly resolve. They are worth stating directly because they represent the actual boundaries of what is known and what is not, and because the space between those boundaries is where both serious historical inquiry and less careful interpretation tend to operate simultaneously. The first question is a measurement question. The newspaper accounts describe skeletal remains at heights that fall well outside the normal range for the populations of the period. If those measurements were accurate, where are the remains, and why does the institutional record not reflect them more clearly? The possible answers range from systematic misreporting by independent observers across multiple states, to accurate reporting followed by material that was lost or inconsistently catalogued, to something in between. The current documentary record does not allow for a clean determination between those possibilities. The second question is an institutional priority question. The Smithsonian's 1894 report was a landmark document, but it was designed to answer a specific question about cultural origins, not to serve as a comprehensive physical anthropology of every specimen recovered from mound contexts. Given that the report's scope was defined by its central argument, what did it not examine with the same rigor it applied to the origins question? This is not a conspiratorial framing. Every research program has a defined scope, and material outside that scope receives less attention. The question is whether the defined scope of the Bureau of Ethnology's mound survey was wide enough to capture the full range of physical evidence the mounds contained. The third question is about the replacement record. When mounds were cleared and built over, what determined which sites were preserved and which were not? The survival of Cahokia and the Angel Mound site and the Miamisburg Mound suggests that preservation was possible when the will to preserve existed. The loss of the surrounding complexes at those same sites suggests that the will was selective. What drove that selectivity is a question the historical record answers only partially. Economic development pressure is the most straightforward answer, and it accounts for most cases. But it does not account for all of them, and the cases it does not account for clearly deserve more specific examination than they have received. The fourth question is about methodology. The physical anthropology of the 19th century was not a neutral science. It operated within frameworks that were shaped by the racial and cultural assumptions of the period. Measurements were sometimes taken selectively, and conclusions were sometimes reached before the evidence was fully examined. This cuts in multiple directions. It means that some claims of anomalous size may have been inflated to fit narratives about lost races or pre-Indian civilizations, which were popular concepts in the period. It also means that some findings that did not fit the preferred institutional narrative may have been minimized or reclassified. Identifying which occurred in which specific cases requires more granular archival work than has been publicly completed. The fifth question is the one that underlies all the others. What does the full record actually contain? Not the published reports, not the synthesized surveys, but the raw accession records, the field notes, the correspondence files, and the storage catalogs of the institutions that received this material. Some of that record has been examined. Much of it has not, at least not with the specific question of anomalous physical measurements, as the organizing inquiry. Independent researchers have submitted Freedom of Information requests to the Smithsonian regarding specific catalog entries. The responses have been inconsistent enough that the question of what the complete internal record shows remains genuinely open. These are not questions with obvious or settled answers. They are questions that the documented record raises and does not resolve. Anyone who tells you the answers are obvious in either direction, either that the giants were definitely real and definitely suppressed, or that the newspaper accounts were all exaggeration and the institutional record is complete and clean, is working with more certainty than the evidence supports. What this subject rewards is careful attention to primary sources, a tolerance for incomplete answers, and a resistance to the pull toward conclusions that feel satisfying before they are earned. The mound record of North America is genuinely remarkable on its own terms. The cultures that built those structures were sophisticated, organized, and capable of large-scale construction and long-distance trade networks that are still being mapped by current researchers. That story does not need embellishment to be worth your attention. What the unresolved questions in this record suggest is not a confirmed cover-up. They suggest that the history of how this continent's pre-Columbian past was studied, collected, and institutionalized is itself a subject that merits continued examination. The documents exist. The archives are large. And the work of reading them carefully is ongoing. That is where this subject actually lives, not in certainty, but in the continued practice of looking closely at what the record shows and being honest about where it stops.